All right, this is on? Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Good morning. So Alex already took the intro part. This is the good thing where he asked me last night, like, do you need an intro? And I said no, because we have an intro slide, and then he does it anyway. So now this was a useless slide. But joking aside, I think it's my fifth summit. I've always loved this event, and I'm very appreciative of being able to be back, and we're grateful for the opportunity. And with that, I want to get started. Today, we'll be talking about remote exploitation on mobile devices. And in particular, I want to start by giving some idea of the motivation we had for the targets that we picked and that we're going to talk about. The first thing was that we wanted to explore something which would fit the category of remote attack surface without user interaction, but was not something related directly to the basebands remote interfaces, and also not something that you would characterize as an app-based zero-click your instant messengers. And so mostly because we wanted to try our hands at something that was new for us. And the second part was that mostly the research we have done, certainly the research we have published, was of the memory corruption garden variety. And we wanted to see if we can put something together where we kind of move away from that and try and create a chain based purely on logic bugs. Partly because, since Alex mentioned it, mitigations, especially in like remote exploit scenarios, are getting more and more and more and more annoying. So an opportunity that you might have with different types of bugs is to just sort of get past all of that, and that's what you're going to see in this presentation. And then the third thing was we have done some research on Huawei devices in the past. As recently as last Black Hat, we gave a presentation on this topic. But what gave us a new opportunity was that in recent times, Huawei moved most of their devices away from AMUI, which is their Android derivative, to what they call HarmonyOS, which is basically their new Android derivative. And also, with doing that, they opened up a publicly accessible bug bounty program for this. So we took that opportunity to participate, and one of the things that they highlight in the program specifically is zero-click interfaces. So that's partly where our motivation came from. And upfront, I want to point out that all the bugs we have done, obviously, because we were interested in the program, among other things, we submitted to them, and I would say that it was a very successful coordinated disclosure. All the bugs were triaged relatively quickly and fixed, so it's all pushed out now. So from my perspective, this is mostly a story of how cooperation between a vendor and a researcher can be useful for all the parties. So with that, let's start talking about the technical stuff. First of all, how we picked what we wanted to look at. So in the past, we talked about this, that some of the defenses that Huawei devices employ, like firmware encryption and secure boot, make it imperative that if you want to do any research on these devices, you need to get familiar with the boot chain. And we have done some of that. But one thing that we haven't looked at all is the aspect of how things are updated, in particular how the ODA updates are done. But what we did know going in is that Huawei certainly has a propensity for wanting to own as much of the platform, both in hardware and software, as possible. So even though Harmony would be a derivative of upstream Android, we had the strong suspicion that even a part as traditional as the OTA update mechanism should be something that, at least in part, is unique to Huawei. And usually for a security researcher, that can be ripe for opportunities. So with that, I'll hand it off to Lóránt, who's going to talk about the remote aspect of our work.
So Huawei firmware update process is very similar to the older versions of the open source Android procedures. It's based on the non-AB partition update scheme. And because it is a non-AB partition update scheme, it has to be carried out outside of the normal Android world. And Huawei implemented a recovery and an e-recovery to do these updates. Recovery is the conventional recovery of the Android systems. It handles the update archive. And e-recovery has one additional feature, but it's very neat. It can download the update through Wi-Fi directly from the recovery. These recovery environments are very similar to the normal Android environments, except the RAM disk is different because of the different binaries it runs, but the kernel is absolutely the same. The file format, the update archive format is also very similar, in fact the same as the ASAP source code. So it's based on the zip format. Because, as you may find out from the title of this presentation, it has a lot to do with the zip format. So here's a recap on the zip file format. Basically, there are three types of chunks in a zip file. The end of central directory, which points to the central directory. The central directory describes a file list which contains in the archive, and third, there are the local files. These are the actual content of the files. Those are pointed by offsets in the file. So it is very flexible. They don't have to lay out side by side. They can randomly placed in the file. Additionally, Android added a signature to these update files, which is appended to the zip. Technically speaking, from the zip point of view, it's part of the comment section, so it's not a new field, but from the verifier, which the update binary uses, it has a distinct magic number, the FF at the end, and duplicates some fields for sanity checks. And most importantly, there's a hash, a signed hash value of almost the whole zip file before. Almost a whole, because the common size variable field is omitted. The signature verification first checks this FF magic value, then makes those sanity checks. The common size must match, the signature size also, and finally it performs the integrity check of this hash and the signature verification. After that, if the verification passes, the extraction, the update archive for extraction, handed over to another zip library. It's a minzip in the Android open source codes. So the first vulnerability is the fact that the verifier and the minzip library handles differently the finding of this EOCD, the end of central directory symbol. This symbol is crucial because that's the entry point for a zip file, because zip file works backwards. First finds the EOCD, then it points to the central directory, then it knows what's the content. So the verifier code directly jumps to the right EOCD because that's written in the appended fields, Android-specific fields. But the minzip implementation implements very generic zip heuristics. It goes from the back of the file and try to find the magic number of this EOCD chunk. So it can be so the signature size or the signature position is not strictly defined by this Android-specific footer. A gap can be made between the end of the zip file and the beginning of this signature. it can be enlarged this distance. So what if we smuggle a zip file to this gap? Because the signature would be valid thanks to the pointers pointing to the right EOCD value, but the minzip implementation could find the smuggled zip inside this gap. It causes a confusion because the verifier verifies successfully the archive, but the extraction happening from our smuggled data. As it turns out, the Android engineers thought about this vulnerability, and it's specifically can be found on the source code of this verifier code, which checks for the EOCD magic number happening after the real EOCD number, so that mitigates this vulnerability. And in fact, that was a very big hint for our research to let's check it on Huawei devices. But unfortunately, Huawei uses a modified code of this upstream verifier, in which this explicit check is missing. So we could achieve this smuggle on Huawei devices. From this, the code execution is given because that's one of the features of update recovery, that it can run the update binary file, because that's what orchestrates, handles the update process itself. So if you can smuggle this update file, we can directly get code execution from putting there our code in that path. But first, we had to check many proprietary Huawei formats specifications. For example, they check for version strings, like sanity checks, if this update is the correct one for this model type of things. There's jar heritage, like the cert.rc, but there's a bug and it only checks the size of this file, not the actual content, so it can be also bypassed. And maybe the most serious check of these verifications is the auth token, the authentication token. Huawei issues authentication token for every legitimate updates, like it's from the OT server, incremental update or a full update. It issues this token, which gets verified in the update binary, in the recovery. And fortunately for us, there's an extra tag, the skip out package tag, which if it's present in the archive, this check it can be omitted. So all of these checks can be bypassed at the end of the day, and we arrive at code execution. How does that work? There are two ways to actually trigger this update. For the local accesses, we can use an SD card or an NM card, as Huawei created a different card, or a USB flash drive directly plugged into the phone. And it contains the update archive on its file system. This kind of local update can be triggered from an unlocked phone, going to this project menu. It's an engineering mode of the Huawei devices, or it can be achieved, the update, from a completely turned off phone by the right key combinations. And it boots to recovery and immediately starts to update from the USB media. But also, these updates can be delivered wirelessly through the official, the conventional update programs running on Android. It is checked automatically, but it can be checked by the user, like pulling down, refreshing thing. And also, there's again another way to achieve it wirelessly for a shutdown phone by turning it on with the right key combination to e-recovery mode. But these update checks queries are performed on an SSL over HTTPS. That means the phone queries if there's any update, and it happens over HTTPS. So and also the certificate for this HTTPS is pinned for the program, so it's not feasible to impersonate the update servers. But the response of this query server contains a big XML file detailing the firmware versions and the download links, and the download links is plain HTTP. Also, the file list, which the phone has to be downloaded for in order to update, contains hashes. But probably those are not for cryptographic purposes, but rather for integrity checks, like spontaneous errors during the download process. And those hashes are also served over HTTP. So it's feasible to do a man-in-the-middle attack and replace those files and hashes. So we can serve or crafted update archives. So it can be seen that on the first slide it's HTTPS, it's encrypted, but the second slide is the actual update, and that can be replaced. An interesting thing of this update process is the interesting aspect is the automatic trigger of it. Whenever someone set up for the first time its Huawei phones, it will be greeted with those two setup pages, the first page, and as you can see, it's quite straightforward, going to enable automatic settings, and I bet not so much user will take the trouble to find the settings manually and turn those off. That means that almost all Huawei devices perform this auto update on a regular basis. It's timely basis. So to actually trigger it, we should adjust the time of these phones, and it can be performed via multiple ways. For example, with our own base station, we can send spoofed, not spoofed, but crafted GPS packages, GSM packages, telling the wrong system time, or using GPS spoofing, which puts the phone in another time zone, and the clock changes because of that on the phone, and the update triggers. And also we can man in the middle the NTP server responses and replace the time there. So based on this, we can actually trigger over the air an update, and from the update we can get this code execution on the recovery. And I forgot to mention that this recovery binary runs as root on the recovery kernel. So there's a huge attack surface to the phone itself. Also, we tried another path with a remote shell, because once the phone in the recovery mode, there's no way to talk back. So there's no way to get data out of the phone. But thanks to the e-recovery function of this Wi-Fi update mechanism, we can actually power on the Wi-Fi chip and connect to our own AP and create a connect back shell. So here's a little demo for it. It's the payload, the update point, updated zip is delivered via USB, but that's indifferent. It could have been deployed via Wi-Fi, and the PC is hosting an AP and the DHCP server, and now our payload connected back to our machine, and indeed it runs as root. So.
Okay. Amazingly enough, we're doing fantastically on time. So now I'm gonna go longer and ruin the schedule anyway. No, just kidding. So this is where we got with the first part. As Lori said, you have a root connect back shell. And what's nice is that, like you have seen, the expectation would be that this should just work everywhere, every time. And indeed, what happened is we started off this research like you would with the devices that we were familiar with. So that would mean Huawei is running previous generation Kirins like 990s. These are the generation of Huawei devices that we talked about before, where we actually explored the bootloader chain and identified vulnerabilities that we were able to exploit and basically create an environment which is nice enough to play around with. Because obviously, after the fact, once the exploit is put together, sure, it works. But what Lori didn't highlight is that, of course, during the development of this, it's quite inconvenient if you don't have a root going in. Obviously, for testing things and trying things out, we did things like the pin certificate, replace that, modify the running update binary on the recovery image to be able to debug things and figure out what's happening. So for all of those things, you want an environment where you can get full control of the recovery or fast boot or what have you. So we had that with the 990s, but we didn't have that with other devices running Huawei code, such as the newer generation SoCs like 9000s, the Kirin 9000s, or also even Huawei devices that run Qualcomm Snapdragons. But once we had this, we were able to give that a try. And luckily, what we found matched what we hoped we would find is that everything worked out of the box. So we did find ourselves with root shells on devices that previously we had nothing on, such as the Kirin 9000s. But still, this is where, let's say 10 years ago, you would be close to done, because you have a root shell and the root can do whatever. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, it's more complicated these days. The biggest thing is that recovery really is not the same context as Android, as Lori pointed out. And it's worth looking at this from the perspective of what would an attacker actually want to do these days. And I would say, this is my opinion anyway, that all the demonstrations of getting into trust zone, getting into the kernel, getting into a hypervisor, getting into the Titan chip or whatever, that's all like cool and everything. But the end result these days for a proper threat actor is really going to be your session keys and encryption keys for end-to-end encrypted things. In other words, the user data. And this is exactly where you have the biggest weakness or drawback of even being root in recovery. Because the thing is that FDE keys, the full disk encryption keys, the file system encryption keys on Huawei devices are of course derived in trust zone. And most importantly, that's only done for Android. So when you're in the recovery context, what you have by default is you have access to flash, but all you're gonna see there is everything on the data partition encrypted. So you don't really get the user data that you were after. So at this point, the question becomes, how can we escalate even further from this root context towards the platform so that we can create a situation where we could actually get those, either get the keys directly or more importantly as the end goal, get to the point where you actually get the plain text data back. So for this, there could be different avenues. We explored some. One somewhat obvious thought would be to go after the trusted application attack surface directly. Because as much as SE/Linux certainly gets in the way, and I'll talk about that right away, one thing that it doesn't stop in this case when you're in this recovery context is talking to trust zone. The reason for this is that the update recovery binary by design talks to some trustlets during the normal recovery, the normal update process. And so therefore, by the SE/Linux rules, it would be possible to talk to some trustlets from this root process that we end up in. This obviously wouldn't be unheard of. As far as I understand, the next talk is going to be about trust zone as well. And as recently as last month, there was a highly rated trustlet vulnerability in a Huawei bulletin. So it's certainly not unheard of as an attack surface, but it's not what we looked at in this research. The second thing would be it's like the analogy with the nail and the hammer, to use what you have, which is the recovery. The main feature that you have is you can override everything on a flash, because that's what you're supposed to be doing. So the immediate idea is, well, let's corrupt firmwares and then get code execution through that in a lower level or more powerful level when you reboot and so on. But obviously, that's what the secure boot is there for. So it's not trivial that there's any way to get enhanced code execution out of that. But I'll talk about that later. And then the third thing, of course, would be to bridge that gap between being UID 0 and actually being in the kernel. The type of difference that, say, 10 years ago was negligible, but these days is actually quite big. And if you can bridge that gap, then use that to your advantage in terms of attacking some other parts of the SOC. So let's see our attempts and our successes or not successes in these different things. So if you want to go by the kernel route, then like I mentioned, old school options like let's kexec into a new kernel execution or insert a module or even devmem, things like this. Obviously, these days, if an SE/Linux context is any good, then even UID 0 processes, even a K helper or whatever, might be quite severely limited. And this is something that Huawei did quite good diligence on. So we are UID 0 looks great in the presentation, but we are quite limited from just about everything that you would be interested in straight away. Like I mentioned, the second obvious thing, which is let's override the kernel image, the Android verified boot does get in the way of that. However, there are two things that you can still try. One is, well, other people, basically. So there's always end days in Linux kernel. And so almost all the time, there's going to be some vulnerability that, oh, this could have been perfect, but it was patched last month or what have you. But keep in mind, well, like I said, with the hammer and the nail, I mean, the one thing we're supposed to be able to do is put on new kernels. And this is where it gets interesting with what exactly things like AVB stop, because the primary goal of something like Android verified boot is to make sure that you are flashing verified images, which is not the same as making sure that you never go back in time to other also previously verified images. And then obviously the final thing is, you do a little bit more work and find your own kernel LPs. So let's look at the different options. Like I said, getting straight around AVB and flashing your own image, or the lazy option. Even though we had secure boot vulnerabilities in the past, this is what our previous presentation was about. First of all, those would need the USB path of the boot chain. Second of all, obviously, Huawei patched these. So they wouldn't have been useful in putting together something that we wanted to look at as a zero-day chain. However, There's something else which is in the way the fastboot operates. It has a number of different flags which are used to unlock the verification functionality of fastboot, which are stored in the NVMe partition. Now the thing is that normally that's a writable partition, so that sounds good for our capability, but it's signed with an RSA key. So we would be stopped. The internet is long and full of terrors, I guess. And as it turns out, somehow, at some point, somewhere, looks like those RSA keys went on a walkabout, and there were websites on the internet that, as a service, offered, just signing images for you, which, first of all, luckily, if you look really closely, you can see that that's an Internet Archive URL, reason being that this has been taken down. So that's nice. And also, since we're technically professional practitioners, we usually try to be, doing legal things. So we skipped this and went for some other things instead, and looked into the end day thing. So this was actually very fruitful. Obvious candidates for us would have been some of the Huawei MPU driver vulnerabilities that we ourselves found, and this was disclosed about a year ago. Those were kernel driver bugs that on their own wouldn't be immediately exploitable because they deal with device nodes that are, again, restricted by SE Linux, but in this case, being root and being root with the SE Linux permissions that we had in this case would have been enough to go after them. But of course, you would consider that they are patched. But you have to answer two questions. One is, okay, there's like a logic gap there. Let's say you override the kernel with an old version. Let's say that works, but how are you going to get your code execution back? Because, okay, you can reboot the kernel, but then you're not running the recovery anymore. Well, as it turns out, we are lucky in this because the way the recovery is programmed is if the update process fails, then the reboot automatically goes into recovery and starts the update process again. So that means that you can, in fact, hot patch the kernel underneath yourselves and get back right where you were. But still, we have to figure out the flashing part versus the verified boot. And as it turns out, we were lucky with this. So why is that? So the way Android verified boot works, at least just focusing on a small detail of it, which is the important part for us here, is that it uses something called the VB meta partition for verifying the boot.image, which is the image that packs in the kernel's image itself. And so this VB meta partition itself is protected by the lower layer of the secure boot architecture, which comes from Huawei and uses this VRL header format. But what we found out, what was important for us, is that in terms of actually changing, the VB meta partition only actually changes in our research with the most major OS updates. So for example, everything through 10, Android 10, Android 10.1, you go month to month the updates, and the VB meta partition doesn't change at all. So you don't even get to start to worry about, does the upstream AVB implementation vary properly about VB meta rollbacks, because you don't even have to roll back anything, because the same exact VB meta was used for the previous kernel image and the previous and the previous. So by default, you can go back to a somewhat old kernel image and everything is going to be fine. You didn't even have to worry about rolling back to VB meta. So that was very nice. Like I said in the beginning, the motivation behind can we do things with like logic tricks is to, well, work less, I guess. So in this case, if you use an AND, I mean, there's still some memory corruption there, of course, in this particular instance, but at least we don't have to do it again, because in the case of that exploit, we've already done that, or more particularly, Jim, who is another member of the team who can be here today, already done that. Having said that, it would be also nice to do something original, so we also looked for kernel 0 days, and long story short, we did find a nice use after free vulnerability in a module that was accessible from every context, even quite limited ones like isolated, which you can see how I rated quite graciously. This has been fixed also, and it's in their bulletin, but we're not going to talk about the details of the vulnerability per se today. To close things off, we will talk about something else, however, which is assuming, based on what I've just explained, us extending our reach into the same power that you have if you're executing kernel code, then what can we do with the platform? Because remember, okay, now we're in the kernel, but we're still zero closer to the FDE keys in practice. So here we went back to something that we did in the past, once again, which is that we looked into what Huawei calls DMSS, which is basically their DDR controller architecture. So it's, and the part of it that's important for us is obviously the security within the SOC. So we just sort of nicknamed this a memory firewall, essentially. I don't want to go into too much of the details of this. Our previous white paper talks about it. But the thing that's just important to understand is that the way it works is that there is this table of permission entries, which they call ASI entries, that control how different cores and different DMA-capable peripherals within the entire SOC can access certain areas of the DDR memory. And back last year, when we looked at this, a nice straightforward bypass of this that we found was that there were some DMA peripherals that weren't considered properly within the ASI entries. So you were able to take a DMA peripheral that you could actually control from the context you were in, which in last year's research was the baseband context, and then you could use that DMA peripheral and execute transactions to get around all this protection. But that particular thing was fixed. So after a black hat, that particular DMA couldn't have been useful for us. However, obviously the question was, okay, well, we had a particular luck with that DMA peripheral, but how about all the other ASI entries? And how about all the other parts of the SoC, other cores or other peripherals? And something that aided us tremendously here, obviously short of which we didn't have data sheets and things like that for the SoC. What we were able to do is find, again, solace in the Linux kernel source, which nicely enumerates what Huawei calls master IDs that helped us make a lot more sense of the ASI entries. Back last year, we had fairly superficial understanding of what each bit and flag in the ASI entries mean, but I think that was also a good case study of how you don't really necessarily need to know everything if you have like a very specific particular goal. But because at the time we knew, okay, in the baseband code we found these two DMA engines, these are the ones that can be controlled. Something ASI, not that important, let's just try what they can access. But here we now actually had to flip that on the head and see, okay, what specifically do these ASI entries allow? And so there we had to understand it better. But once we figured out the master IDs from the header file, we had a better understanding. And the long story short is that we did get lucky and found yet again another DMA engine which had two open accesses and could directly override trust zone memory. So that would be almost perfect, you're almost done. But there's an important part missing here, which is, okay, but who can be a master for that particular core, which was in the kernel at the time. So that's not perfect for us yet. However, there was another aspect of the patches that Huawei created that we wanted to look at, which was, it was only part of the story that we found bugs in the past that there were DMA peripherals where the rules were too permissive. The other part, and we thought the much bigger problem at the time, was that DMSS was only for particular part of the memory, the DDR memory. However, these ASI entries were not in DDR memory. So at the time we thought that, well, this is sort of like an unfixable issue and a big problem with the platform design, which just creates an end around the whole thing. However, it turned out that, well, Huawei is much smarter than that, because once we applied their patch, we saw that, okay, no, this doesn't work anymore. You cannot access those entries. Obviously, it's not because of ASI entries adding new restrictions, since that cannot apply to something that is not DDR memory. So at that point, we knew, all right, but there's something that we totally don't understand, that there's got to be something here which is already built in and thought of before, a functionality which is meant to also protect non-DDR memory, but apparently it just wasn't programmed properly. And so the long story short was that we did something similar to what we did with when our boot ROM vulnerabilities got patched. We went back to looking at the patch and diffed the Huawei patches, and basically identified in the ER3 code, which is the secure monitor code, so the lowest layer of the trust zone architecture, the new code that was added, and it was again the similar process. So you see in the code that it is creating some table at some weird physical addresses that don't mean anything to you. But we take those physical addresses and we go back to the kernel source code, hoping that maybe there's some reference to it there. And again, we get lucky because there's some headers in the kernel source that help identify some notion of what these addresses mean. And from the references to things like the config bus and the NOC, and then some trial and error of fiddling with the bits, the picture came together that basically what Huawei had already built in prior to disclosing the previous bugs is that there's this NOC-like structure used in the SoC where apparently the DDR can act as a target node and different cores apparently as source nodes. And that way you can have these bilateral connections of, okay, what can access what. But of course, once we saw that, we knew that, well, this is how it works, and the only new entries here that we see are specific to the modem. So then the question obviously comes to, well, maybe the patch they added thought about what the report was about, which is the modem can access these ASI entries, but maybe some other things can access the ASI entries still. And we went back fishing and got lucky again, because long story short, we found a bunch of DMA peripherals, which once again were able to just directly rewrite the ASI entries, because in this NOC table or whatever it is, there were no new entries added that considered them. And in fact, not just with DMA peripherals or DMA capable peripherals, but we also found that another core, the low power memory controller unit, the LPMCU, also had the capability of overriding this important area, and the modem had the capability of overriding the SRAM where the LPMCU runs. Again, the key was the LPMCU doesn't run in DDR memory, it runs in SRAM. So none of the SI entries that were valid for the modem stopped it from accessing the LPMCU. So that must have been way too fast and way too confusing. But the main thing is that we identified these nice hops where eventually we could get to trust zone, and it's all just direct, simple writes to create transactions. You don't even need code execution. So even if we think back to like exploiting the kernel, actually we don't even need to get code execution in the kernel. So anything that would be, again, exploit mitigations between a wild write in the kernel or getting actually shellcode executed in the kernel, you don't need any of that, because we just need to write, make like 4 writes to physical particle addresses to fire off a DMA transaction. But the problem is we still had something missing, because all these nice looking things that we found, like going from the modem to the LPMCU or using the modem to control these DMA engines like the DMA, all of that presumed being in a modem. But luckily, we had one final success, because we found that yet one more DMA peripheral, which is the eDMA, which is the modem's own DMA engine, which is really not something that it's supposed to be used by the kernel, nonetheless had control registers in memory area that were accessible to the kernel. So basically, in multiple hops, you can use the modem's own DMA engine to go from the kernel into the modem, and then from the modem you can go to the LPMCU, and then from the LPMCU you can go to the trust zone. And with that, we get to the very end of the presentation. The only thing that's left is one more demo that I showed you guys. This was the last thing that we did that, okay, in theory, once you can override trust zone, you could hot patch the trustless that have got to do with key derivation and unlocking the device and things like that. So that sounds nice, but we did want to show that in practice something like that is possible. There's a nice presentation, fairly recent, about how FD keys are derived in Huawei. It's for a previous generation, but it's still in Lightning. So I don't want to go into too much details about that. I guess what's important, just superficially, is that there are a couple of trustlets, the gatekeeper and the keymaster, that you need to modify, which we can do to get rid of, for example, things like the exponential backoff of pin tries, or the trustlet proactively using the RPMB partition to log failed attempts and lock the user out. So if you patch all those out, then you quickly get to code running in trust zone, which basically allows you to very efficiently, if you want, just offline brute force a user pin. And then that way, obviously, once you recover what the user entry is supposed to be, you will magically open up the FD keys. So this is just an old school terminal only demo of that. And that's going to be the end of the presentation. So what you see here is that, yeah, we root, and that's lovely, but by default, all the files are just mumbo jumbo. But obviously what you don't see here is we had the trust zone modified. And so then we can start brute forcing. We're going to skip into it a little bit. Obviously, we set a low key in this case, but even the full space you can go through fairly quickly, assuming 4-digit pins in this case. And you can see once that runs through, the trust zone basically takes care of it for you, and you just get back what you were interested in, which is all the user data. So that's the end of the presentation in terms of the technical parts. And then I do want to finish again on the note of just mentioning the disclosure process again. Obviously, like I mentioned, everything was reported and everything has been fixed, fairly recent. So the kernel 0 day just last month, all the other things that we talked about, the bulletins came out in February and March. So obviously, we were happy that we were able to participate in that, and also that we were able to present the results. So grateful for that. And I would say that, how much time do we have? Maybe 1 minute. So in that 1 minute, I guess I would just close with our experience in terms of participating in the program is that I would say it's definitely one of the way I would put it is like serious mobile bounty programs out there, with both aspects of that. So I don't think these targets are like too simple or easy or ridiculous. It's very, very obvious that their engineers are trying to have a roadmap where they think about something and they do some due diligence on that, and then they create incentives in terms of what they would pay good money for targets that they already put some thought into, and not just sort of like opening themselves up and like, we didn't think about this code, can you find bugs in it? So I think that's a positive, and so I would say it's a challenge. It's not too easy or whatever, and they certainly take the coordinated disclosure process very seriously. So you want to make sure, if you want to participate, that you consider the rules, but they also take seriously what they say about the potential rewards. I've had experience with the opposite of that, where sometimes bounty program rules sound like super cool in terms of how much money you can make, and then if you submit bugs like that, it turns out that the numbers are more aspirational as opposed to what the rewards will actually be. So that's not the case with them, which I think is a big positive. So overall, we're happy with that. So thank you, everyone, and we'll just like to open it up for questions.